The question, as Aaron mentioned, was my prayer for you. My prayer would simply be this. I'll just give you where we're going to head, and then we're going to build it. You as a church and each of you as individuals would always be in awe, overwhelmed in wonder of the mercy and grace of our God. And I'd like to build that out of a story of the Old Testament. If you've been around me a while, you know I love the Old Testament stories. And we're going to camp out at one today. I'm just going to give you some forewarning. Some of you are going to hyperventilate at this thought. We're going to use history and geography to make a spiritual point. Now, some of you have repressed thoughts about history and geography since you were in school. And you're about ready to break out into hives thinking about diving into those kind of subjects again. And you're like, I think I slept through every lecture on history or geography in school. They're the most boring things in the world. So maybe you'll get some good sleep this morning. But we're going to walk a little bit of a journey together. I'm going to be reading a story out of the book of 2 Kings in the Old Testament. 2 Kings, it's about a third of the way through the Bible. It's right after the book of 1 Kings. I'm here to help you. 2 Kings chapter 3. So I'm going to be reading this story. If you want to, you can open your Bible and follow along, or your app, whatever you've got on your smartphone, or you can just listen. And I'm also going to give you forewarning on something, because a lot of times a pastor or preacher will actually read through a text and then he'll preach on the message of that text. And I'm going to keep pausing and editorializing. And eventually you're going to go and look at whoever's sitting near you and you're going to say, if this is just the reading and then he's going to do a whole message, we're not going to get done till supper time. And this is going to be a problem. And so I'm just going to tell you, actually working through the story is the message. And we're going to walk through this little journey together. So it's found in 2 Kings chapter 3. I'm going to start in verse 1 and just unpack a little bit of it for you. I'm going to stop repeatedly as we go through this. It says this in verse 1. Joram, or depending upon your translation, it might have a variant of his name, Jehoram. Joram, the son of Ahab, the king of Israel in Samaria, became the king of Israel in Samaria in the 18th year of Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, and he reigned 12 years. But he did evil in the eyes of the Lord, but not as his father and mother had done. He got rid of the sacred stone of Baal that his father had made. Nevertheless, he clung to the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, which he had caused Israel to commit. He did not turn away from them. So we're going to pause here. Now, I don't know how it is when you read the Bible, but typically when I read some parts of the Bible and I get to something like this and I go, I don't know the names of these people. I don't know who they are. I don't know where they're at. I don't know what their connection is. I'm just going to keep on cruising through and read so that I can get to the stuff I can understand. I mean, we don't even know if we can pronounce all these names right. You don't even know if I'm pronouncing their names right. If I look confident, then you think I know what I'm saying. That's the way you should read the Bible, by the way. Sound confident, just make it up and how you want to pronounce it, and people will think that you're really intelligent. So, who are these people? Who is this Joram guy that we just got introduced to? Well, let me give you a little bit of context for this. Joram becomes king. Now, it tells us who his dad was. Did you catch the name of his dad? His dad's name was Ahab. Now, if you grew up in church, don't feel bad if you don't know the answer to some of these things I'm going to share with you. It's not going to make or break whether you get to go to heaven with God forever, all right? But if you grew up in church, you might know that Ahab had a wife, and her name was Jezebel. Ahab and Jezebel is like the name that reigns in infamy in the Bible. They were the most dysfunctional, evil, occult-ridden marriage couple in the Bible. I can say with a great deal of confidence that my daughter and son-in-law are going to present me with my first grandchild this fall, which is really about everything that matters in the universe right now. And I can just say with a great deal of confidence that they will not choose the name Ahab or Jezebel. for this child. Okay? Nobody does that, right? They're not good names, Ahab and Jezebel. So Joram grew up in a terribly dysfunctional family. I don't know what your story is. Some of you have grown up in a great deal of dysfunction. I'm not here to make light of that. I'm just going to say Joram gets that. He grew up in a home that was self-serving, evil. His parents were ruthless. They had no ethics. They had no good character, no values. They would steal from people. They would murder people to get what they wanted. They came to a horrible, evil, untimely death, a judgment from God. That's the life Joram grew up in. And then he becomes king. I guess the only part of dysfunction he didn't have, he grew up in the palace, so he wasn't poor. But pretty much everything else we could view as dysfunctionally negative. Now, what is this kingdom? Now, you're going to see we've got a little bit of map up here because I'm going to help you with your geography. So let's start with the people of God, the Jewish people. If I were to ask you who was the first king in the nation of Israel, you would tell me his name was Saul. Saul was the first king. He was taller than me. He was a warrior, unlike me. He was a really wonderful, godly man, given a godly mantle to lead. But he quickly slid into selfishness, seemed to want to do his things his own way all the time. A lot of lessons we can learn out of his life. Ultimately, God sets him aside because he wouldn't follow God's pathway on how to be king. Which leads to the second king, the most famous king in all the history of Israel. His star is still on their flag today. His name was David, the shepherd boy who became king. King David reigns wonderfully for many years, not perfect person, but nonetheless a good and godly king and leader. And then his son, the richest man on the planet, the most wise person that ever lived, other than in his dating and marriage relationships, which is another story. But he wrote what we would call the Proverbs, words of wisdom for us. His name was Solomon. Solomon. So Saul, David, Solomon, and then Solomon's son followed him. His name was... Oh, this is where it gets tough. All right? This is what becomes a problem. I heard somebody say the right name, but there's not many who know it. His name was Rehoboam. There's a reason you don't remember or know his name. He was an idiot. Okay, that's good Hebrew language there. That's what it is. He was an idiot. He became this young king. He took all the counsel from the wrong people. He ignored the counsel from the right people. He did things the way he wanted to, and it didn't go well. He thought he could bully his way across the whole scope of leadership, and it didn't happen that way. Ultimately, his foolishness led to essentially a civil war, and the nation of Israel split into two nations, northern and southern. And that's what we see here. So, the gold part, the kingdom known as Judah, would be where Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, got to continue to be king. But it was far less than the country had been. It was a small remnant in many ways. Their capital was Jerusalem. In all the history of Judah, about half the kings were godly and half of them not so much. But they all were of the line of David and then Solomon. They were all relatives in that same family line. And that's one of the other names we found in this story. His name is Jehoshaphat. He's a king in the gold area, the kingdom of Judah, capital Jerusalem. Jehoshaphat was generally a godly guy. Not perfect, made some really boneheaded moves, maybe a lot like you and me, wanting to do well, not always getting it right. Then you have the northern kingdom. It's called Israel. This capital is Samaria. That's where there was a new king. His name was Jeroboam when there was a civil war. You saw Jeroboam's name show up here. Jeroboam was given an opportunity like Saul was at the very beginning to lay tracks for a marvelous godly kingdom of people who would follow God, a whole nation who would impact the world. And he quickly got full of himself and did his own way. As a matter of fact, in the history of the nation of Israel, the blue part there, never once did they have a godly king. Not a single one. Some were better than others. Some were not as evil as others. None of them loved God. None of them led well. That's where Joram comes in, following Ahab. So this is the context we find of this story. Now we know a little bit of the history and the geography, both of which are going to be important in what we see coming up next. So let's continue the story now that we know a little bit about who these weird people are and all these names. Verse 4, now Mesha, the king of Moab, we got more names in more places. Mesha, the king of Moab, raised sheep, and he had to pay the king of Israel a tribute of 100,000 lambs and the wool of 100,000 rams. But after Ahab died, the king of Moab rebelled against the king of Israel. That's Joram. So at that time, King Joram set out from Samaria, mobilized all the army of Israel. He also sent a message to Jehoshaphat, king of Judah. This is where you need to put on a whiny voice, all right? The king of Moab has rebelled against me. Will you go with me to fight Moab? I will go with you, Jehoshaphat replied. I am as you are. My people as your people, my horses as your horses. Let's stop there. So who is this people of Moab? Well, you can see the nation of Moab is kind of to the southeast. And the nation of Moab was a vassal nation under Israel. They were under the thumb. They had a forced treaty. They had to pay tribute. Taxation without representation. Do you think they enjoyed that? Not at all. Do you remember a little bit of the history of our own country? How much did we enjoy that? I seem to remember a story about a bunch of tea being thrown into Boston Harbor, all right? Because nobody likes to be in that kind of position. So if you're tired of taxation without representation, if you're tired of being forced laborers for somebody else, if you don't want to be under the thumb, when's a good time to rebel against them? Transition of leadership, right? Ahab's gone. Young whippersnapper's there. We don't know if he has any backbone. Don't know if he can stand up. He hasn't established himself yet. Let's thumb our nose at him and tell him to take a hike. And that's what they do. And Moab does that, and they put all their army right there on the border between the blue and their country. They put all their special forces there. They've got their tanks, artillery, everything sitting right there, ready to go. Now, if you're the new young leader, what are you going to do about this? This is your first test of leadership, right? You need to prove that you are the leader above all leaders, that you are the man or woman for the hour. You need to prove that this is the right time and you're the right person. So Joram, not going to stand for this. He's going to quash this rebellion, come down hard on it. But he wants to guarantee a victory. He wants to win, and he wants to assure himself. So first of all, he calls up all his own army. Then he reaches out to Jehoshaphat and says to Jehoshaphat, hey, will you help me? And Jehoshaphat says, oh, sure. We're all related. We're Jewish people. We're all family. We're all together. I'm here with you, buddy. Now, he's got two armies, right? His own army and the army of Judah. We also will find out in a moment he actually gains a third army because the kingdom of Edom at the very bottom there is under the thumb of the gold of Judah. Forced laborers, forced treaty, same idea. So when he picks up the army of Judah, he also, because they have a contractual, a treaty agreement, picks up the army of Edom. So now he's got three armies, stacks the deck. Kind of a smart man, sort of. And he's going to win this thing. Now, we need to pause with Jehoshaphat here for a minute. Jehoshaphat served for a long time, about 50 years as king. He actually served during three different kings, Ahab, Joram, and people who followed Joram. He served during the same time as all of them. If you will read the Bible, you will find that with all three kings in the nation of Israel, he entered into some sort of a collaboration, an agreement, a partnership. And not one of those three times did it go well for him. There's actually a principle in the Bible that we're not to be unequally yoked, that those who don't have the same kind of values as we do. You can find it in the book of Corinthians. It's modeled throughout the Old Testament. it says we need to be really careful about the kind of agreements, the kind of partnerships we hook up into and what we do with other people. And Jehoshaphat just couldn't seem to help himself. Now, I get to these moments, I go, why is Jehoshaphat so dumb about this? Why doesn't he learn? And this is where I'm really happy that imperfect people are in the Bible. Because maybe I'm the only one in the room, but I've had a number of things in life that I've actually had to learn repeatedly. Why? Because I make the same mistake repeatedly. You would think that after the second, third time, it's like, hello, McFly, get your act together. Don't keep doing the same dumb thing. And yet I do. Sometimes I've done the same dumb thing a whole lot more than just 3 times. And we're going to find out a little bit about how God cares for even those of us that can't quite follow him perfectly well as much as we would wish. So this is the story as it picks up here. Now, Jehoshaphat asked an interesting question. It's going to be important for us. He wants to know how we're going to do this. So verse 8, well, by what route shall we attack? Now, here's where we learn something more of what Joram's thinking about. Through the desert of Edom, Joram answered. So the king of Israel set out with the king of Judah and the king of Edom. And after a roundabout march of 7 days, the army had no more water for themselves or for their animals that were with them. So what's Joram thinking to do? Well, he wants to come all the way down or around, actually to the backside, and come up and have a sneak attack from the back. He thinks, hey, we know Moab put all their army up on our border, so we're going to go down all the way around that big body of water. He now has permission to march his army through Judah and through Edom because they're all partnering with him. 3 armies head around to do a secret surprise attack from the southeast. This is going to be their marvelous military plan. There's only one problem. You have to march through what was it of Edom? The wilderness of Edom. Now, when you think wilderness in the Middle East, you think brown, dry, tumbleweeds rolling by, scorpions scurrying about, no water, no marvelous oasis to just camp out at, certainly no 7-Eleven. And so they've marched now tens of thousands of soldiers for a week through the wilderness to make this surprise attack. And they don't have water. You can say, well, why don't they have water right there? You see all that blue? It's highly salty. It's called the Dead Sea. You don't want to drink it. Not really going to go well. So now they've got all these soldiers dying of thirst. I have a problem. They didn't have enough, what do you call them in the military, MREs, meals ready to eat. It even says their animals are dying. Well, why did they take their animals? It's like, did they take Fluffy, their cat? What's the pets going with them? Well, they take these animals with them because this is the days before preservatives and refrigeration. So you take the animals with you. It's actually taking your meals. So you take the livestock, both for milk and whatever else, and also for slaughtering for meat, and that's how you do it. But now their animals are dying, their soldiers are dying, and they're supposed to have a fight. Now watch what Joram does. Now I'm sure none of you have ever done this, but just watch what I don't know if you know this, the Bible's a pretty funny book. There's just some really funny things that just make us laugh out loud. So we get to this part where they had no more water for themselves. In verse 10, what, exclaimed the king of Israel? Has the Lord called us 3 kings together only to deliver us into the hands of Moab? Does that seem odd to you? I mean, here's this guy, he goes, I can't believe God did this to us. And you're like, well, wait a minute. He doesn't even believe in God. He doesn't follow God. He didn't consult God. God has no part of his life or his kingdom whatsoever. And now, in his most difficult moment, guess who he's going to blame? God. This reveals a couple of interesting things for us, I think. First, deep down, all of us know that there is a true God. Everybody knows. People deny it. They can claim to be an atheist. They can claim to have no religion. They can claim to follow other religions. And deep down, there's certain moments that will reveal that we all know there is a true God. And if we can't humble ourselves to own our own missteps, our own mistakes, our own failures and flaws, we will tend to blame that God at those moments. Have you ever blamed God for something? Have you ever blamed God for something that in reality he had no real part in? And now you expect him to bail you out of something that he didn't even want to put you in. You made the choice. And that's exactly what Joram does. He blames God. So we have three very interesting kings. We have Joram, a godless king. No religion, no faith. Well, he has religion, but it's occultic. It's demonic. Nothing of the true God in him at all. You have Jehoshaphat, who's a good and godly guy, but far from perfect, flawed. You have the other king. Did you catch his name? I didn't either. He doesn't have a name. Well, he probably has a name, but it's not in the Bible. King of Edom. He didn't even want to be there, right? He just dragged along. He's a nameless guy who gets dragged along in this whole thing. Here's my thought for you as we finish the story in the next few minutes. In some way, each of us are like one of these three kings, maybe sometimes like all three of them. There's probably some circumstances that you can look at and you're like, there wasn't anything really godly in my thinking here at all. There wasn't anything righteous or spiritual. I'm just doing my own thing, and I don't even consider God. Or maybe you're a little bit like Jehoshaphat, and you have days when you actually do want to follow God well. And you do it kind of good in some ways and kind of not so much in other ways. Or maybe some days you're more like the king of Edom. You don't quite know how you got caught up in this car wreck, but you did. You feel like a nobody, and yet you face the consequences of other people's choices. It really wasn't your intention to be there. You didn't want to get caught up in whatever it was that you're facing, and now you're stuck with it. And the consequences, undeserved, are yours to carry as well. And I want you to just think a little bit about where you might fit into that. And watch how God responds to all three of these kings who maybe represent the way all of us are at various times in our life. Jehoshaphat makes an interesting statement next. Jehoshaphat says, well, wait a minute. Is there no prophet of the Lord here whom we might inquire of the Lord? Basically, he says, maybe this would be a good time for a prayer meeting, right? Probably a good thought. Probably should have done the prayer meeting about 9 days before. But here's a good principle. We ought to pray first. But if we don't, we ought to pray when we realize we ought to pray. It's never too late to seek God. We should consult God first. We should make decisions guided by His Holy Spirit. We should listen to His voice and obey. But when you find out that you didn't, don't simply bury your head in shame. Turn to God. It's never too late to turn to God. Joshua says, we need to turn to God. We need help here. We need to figure this out. And catch what happened. This is fun. An officer of the king of Israel, that's not Jehoshaphat, that's Joram. An officer of Joram, the godless king, answered and said, Elisha the son of Shaphat is here. He used to pour water on the hands of Elijah. And Jehoshaphat said, oh, the word of the Lord is with him. So the king of Israel and Jehoshaphat and the king of Edom went down to him. Now, we just need to pause here because this is like a movie scene of all movie scenes. You say, well, what's the idea that Elijah and Elisha, there's this whole pouring water on the hands thing? I don't get that at all. It's basically just a verbiage of the Hebrew language that says the one guy mentored the other. So Elisha, who is here, was mentored by, served, and learned under Elijah. Well, why does that matter? Well, that matters because if you were to read the stories of Joram's dad and mom, Ahab and Jezebel, they had what they self-proclaimed as their archenemy, the nemesis of everything they tried to do. His name was Elijah. Elijah would come and prophesy against them. He would tell them that things would go poorly. It was the judgment of God. And Ahab and Jezebel had nothing good to say about Elijah. And now, so if you're standing with the kings at this day, if you get to stand in the company of the king, who gets to stand there with him? Who's standing with Joram? Well, it would be his closest consultants and advisors, right? His cabinet. So, godless Joram, one of his most trusted advisors, speaks up. Basically, Jehoshaphat says, hey, we need to pray. And one of Joram's closest trusted advisors says, Elisha's here. He could probably help us. And I will tell you that all the air was sucked out of the room right then. Everybody went, oh, I can't believe he said that. Well, why would that matter? Because of all this history that is there. So, for example, if you were to go back to 1 Kings chapter 18, you'd read a story. Some of you remember it. You grew up on flannel graph with these things. And there was a story where Elijah, at the guidance of God, had said there's not going to be rain for 3 years, and there wasn't. It was a judgment upon that nation of Israel for not following God. Ahab was the king. At the end of those 3 years, Elijah walks up to the people of Israel, has Ahab and everybody, says, hey, it's time you make up your mind if you're going to follow God or not. So here's what we're going to do. Bring out all the prophets and priests of your gods, Baal and others, and I'm going to come. We're going to build an altar, you guys, for your gods. I'm going to build an altar for my God, the true God. And we're all going to pray and ask for the true God or gods to bring down fire on the altar and sacrifice that we have here. He says, you guys can go first. Ahab's there watching all this. There's a chance that his son Joram was with him, standing at his side. If he didn't stand with him, he surely knew the story of his dad being there, and there was 400 prophets of Baal. They spent the whole morning doing occultic prayers and chants, bleeding themselves out, all kinds of things. Nothing happened. Eventually Elijah, the guy who trained Elisha, who's in our story, starts getting tired of this, gets a little sarcastic with them. Hey, maybe your God's on vacation, a little bit out of cell range. Maybe he's in the bathroom reading People magazine and it's taken a while. Maybe. And he starts ripping on them and ridiculing them. And eventually he says, enough of this. He says, I'm going to take my turn and pray. But first, let's dump like truckloads of water on this whole thing. And then he says a prayer, and in a moment, fire comes down from the sky. It not only takes out the sacrifice, it takes out the altar. There's this crater left in the ground. And he basically says, hey, so which God do you want to follow? And they had a brief but powerful revival. It didn't last real long. By the way, Elijah led them to execute all those false, demonically occultic priests and prophets of the false gods. And they were all put to death there. Joram knows all of this. So when his guy says, hey, let's talk to Elisha, he's here. Oh, that's a tense moment. And probably the only thing that saves the tension of the moment is Jehoshaphat, who speaks up and says, hey, I saw him on the God channel. He's pretty good. Okay? That's basically what he says. I know of him. He can lead us in prayer. So they go, I don't know why Elisha is there. Is he like on vacation in the wilderness, sipping iced tea? Is he a chaplain of one of the armies? Did God just tell him to go on a hike out there? I don't know. But God orchestrated all of this. And so they go to Elisha. And let's pick it up from there. We're going to go to verse 13. Elisha said to the king of Israel, why do you want to involve me? Go to the prophets of your father and the prophets of your mother. That's hysterical. He basically says, Joram, why would you come to me? You have your own God. You don't even follow my God. You don't even believe the true God. Go to all the leaders, all the prophets, the pastors, the priests of your own gods. Oh, that's right. They're dead. Remember they were executed? That's funny. The Bible is a funny book. This would make for a great, great movie scene. I just got to tell you. So why do you want to involve me? Go to the prophets of your father and your mother. No, the king of Israel answered, because it was the Lord who called us 3 kings together to deliver us the hands of Moab. I hope that none of us in this room are stubborn like Joram, but I predict that some of us are. Because Joram's not backing down. He's not going to own his flaws or his faults, his selfishness and his stubbornness. He's going to continue to blame God. And Elisha said, as surely as the Lord Almighty lives, whom I serve, if I did not have respect for the presence of Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah, I would not even pay attention to you. Now bring me a harpist. Now, does that sound odd to you? We have had, I like a good action movie, right? We've had a good action movie so far. We've got kings and succession and transition and intrigue. We've got battles going on and armies marching through. We got wilderness. Nothing nice. This is not for pansies. This is like serious stuff. We've got all this intrigue. We have the irony and the tension of the cabinets together and these three kings and the vassal kings. And there's all this stuff going on. And then we have this guy, Elisha, who shows up and there's just the tension. You could cut it with a knife. All these feelings swirling around. And Elisha says, could somebody bring me a harpist? My girls, I had two girls, and they would look at me sometimes as a dad and go, Dad, you're so random. And that's exactly what this feels like. We have this major story with all this intrigue, and then he's like, I could really use a harpist right now. How do you feel about that? I wonder why he did that. I have a thought. We don't know for sure, but here's my sense. Is that sometimes our blood pressure is boiling. We're facing something. We're fearful. We're angry. We're stressed. We're in pain. We're hurting. Whatever it is that we're facing on the journey of our life. And we need desperately to hear from God and follow Him. But the noise of all we're going through is so loud in our head that we can't with confidence know that we can hear from God. I think Elisha could have said, you know what I think God's going to say? Go die in the wilderness. I'm not here for you. But Elisha wasn't sure what God was saying. And I think he needed to separate himself, pause long enough, move off to the side, and just get in the presence of his God. Worship. And he basically said, could I have a good Hillsong CD? Could maybe I have some good Gaithers music, something that will help focus me? And can I just say, in the life of our regular weeks, there's probably some times that we need to step back, whether it's just spending some time in the Bible or listening to some worship music, finding a quiet place to walk a trail in a park, somewhere where we get away from the noise of everything and hear God. And that's what this prophet does. And then exactly that happens. He hears from God. So it says, while the harpist was playing, the hand of the Lord came on Elisha. And he comes back and tells them all, this is what the Lord says, I will fill this valley with pools of water. For this is what the Lord says, you will see neither the wind nor the rain, yet this valley will be filled with water, and you, your cattle, and your other animals will drink. Here's the key verse of the whole story. This is an easy thing in the eyes of the Lord. This is an easy thing in the eyes of the Lord. And by the way, He will also deliver Moab into your hands. We'll stop there. So he comes back. They consult in prayer. Comes back. He says to the three kings, you'll find it in some of the other translations, they'll take what the Hebrew actually is implying here. They tell their soldiers to dig trenches in this valley, in the wilderness, in the sand. These dying soldiers, they're supposed to get that little flip-down shovel thing out of their backpack and dig some ditches in a place where there's never water. Can you imagine if you're in the military then and those three kings come and say, oh, by the way, we did a little prayer time. Here's what we think we should do. We'd like you all to dig trenches because we're going to have a bunch of water in the valley. It's like those kings have sunstroke. This is like the dumbest thing I've ever heard. But that's exactly what happened. I don't know exactly how God did it. It may be that Some of you have been in places like out in Arizona where there can be a flash flood. It can rain 10 miles away. You don't even see the clouds, but the water will suddenly come through the valley where you're at. Could be, or some other way. One way or another, as morning comes, God fills these valleys with water. Now, the other thing, I'm not going to read the rest of the chapter, but you'll find this, is that their idea of doing this surprise sneak attack from the backside was the worst kept secret ever. Okay, Moab, they had their satellites cruising over top. They had the drones flying. They had their spies who infiltrated. They knew all of this. And while these guys, these jokers, are making this 7-day trek through the wilderness, Moab's brought their whole army down to that border, looking toward the east, southeast. They know those three armies are there. It's not a secret at all. And as the sun comes up from the east over the shoulders of these three armies, in the red clay of Middle Eastern wilderness, they just see the sun reflect off of all this red glow of liquid in this valley. And the people of Moab, the army of Moab, can come to only one logical conclusion. Those goofballs couldn't even get along long enough to fight us. They've actually killed each other. And their red blood has filled that valley. There could be no other explanation. There's never rain there. There's never water there. There's no springs there. There's nothing there. And if I see red in that early morning sun, it can only be the blood of all those armies. They've killed each other. Then they immediately have a second thought. It's the word plunder. There's stuff there, right? So, if Josh and I are side by side in our little foxhole, ready, and we look out there, it's like they're all dead. They've all killed each other. There's stuff out there. What I care about is that I run there faster than Josh, because he can have the bronze stuff that he finds. I want the gold and the silver stuff I find. Okay? I want the $100 bills. He can have the $1 bills, right? Away we go. So we go running. By the way, I don't know this for sure, but I'm going to just predict, if I want to run fast, I don't want to be carrying big weaponry with me. So I set down my shield and my sword so that I got two arms to carry all the stuff. One way or another, the army of Moab goes running up into this valley. And can you imagine the surprise? I mean, there's these three armies, tens of thousands of men. They're just down on their hands and knees drinking water that has filled this valley, feeling life coming back to them. And here comes the unarmed army that they're supposed to fight running to them. And here we find God does an amazing thing. You and I are not really very good at multitasking, but God is. God took care of their immediate need. If I don't get a drink in the next 30 minutes, I'm going to die. And God took care of their big picture need. We're going to have a battle. And we'd like to win and be able to go home to our families. And God pulls all of that out. So here's my closing thoughts for all of you, because remember I said I want you to be in wonder of the mercy and grace of God. Nobody in this story deserved the salvation and help of God. Joram didn't. All of his godless army, they didn't. Joram was just doing his own thing his own way. He didn't care about anything else. He's just trying to establish his leadership so he can lead poorly. And God showed mercy on him, messed up though he was. And I just want to say, I don't know what all you've done. I don't know that you can be a whole lot worse than Joram. I don't know that your life can be much more dysfunctional than his. And I just say to you, God is amazingly gracious and merciful. Even when you try to blame him for things, even when you do things your own way and don't consult him, even when you don't even believe on him or live for him, God is amazingly gracious and merciful. And Jehoshaphat didn't really deserve any help. I mean, he tried to follow God, but he hadn't consulted God. He just did what seemed right in his own eyes. He just thought, oh, surely I should do this. And he didn't do it the right way at all, and he just yanked himself and all of his guys into a bad place. And God showed mercy on him. And the king of Edom, who didn't deserve really any of it, but is just caught up in this worst situation, God shows up for him as well. He was nameless. He was caught in the crossfire. He was carrying the consequences that weren't of his choice, and God met him as well. God cares and serves and loves and shows grace to all. And I hope for every day that you and I walk this planet, we're in awe that God would be like that. That he would do that kind of a thing for us. And I don't know what you face this week. Some of you are carrying huge weights. Some of you, people around you, know the pain and the suffering, the difficulty that you face. Others of you are carrying heavy things in privacy. Nobody really knows what you were thinking last night. Nobody really knows the dark night you've just had, the difficult weeks or months you're going through, what you fear as you walk out of church here today and will walk back into. Some of you have really deep, dark, heavy things that you're carrying. And I'm not here to tell you it's not a big deal. It is. It's a big deal, whatever it is that you're facing. But I don't think it's a bigger deal than having tens of thousands of people dying in a wilderness. They're about ready to die either of thirst or of battle. Either way, it's not going to go well. This was a big, dark day. So whatever you face, I just want to say to you the same thing that Elisha said to them all. This is an easy thing in the eyes of the Lord. Whatever you face, God doesn't always just do it the way you think. I mean, none of them expected this to be solved the way it was. God will surprise you how he solves things. He often waits until the 11th hour to make us remember that we need to trust on him and lean on him. He's not our cosmic Santa Claus just to do our wishes, but he does show up. And he does show grace and mercy. It's actually an easy thing in the eyes of the Lord. Let me pray for you. Heavenly Father, I thank you for stories like this, and where a little bit of history and a little bit of geography will remind us that you are an amazing God. Lord, there's so many times that I've been like Joram and I've just done my own thing. I even knew I was doing it in rebellion against you. I didn't deserve anything, and yet you still love me. You still show grace. Lord, there's been times I've been like Jehoshaphat, and I try to do well, and I just can't seem to get it right. And you show mercy and grace. And there's times that I've been swept up like a nameless person in somebody else's problem, and I didn't even want to be there, but I was facing it all, and you show up. I'm so grateful that you're that kind of a God. And I pray for my friends here that whatever they face this week, they would find in the most astounding ways that their issue is not too big for you. It is an easy thing in the eyes of the Lord. Thank you, Lord. Amen.